Good morning. On behalf of the Knowledge Consortium of Gujarat, I welcome Professor Vivian Bomfield to the SANDHAN studio for Samvad to deliver her lecture titled Science and Sanskrit, Vivekananda's Views on Education. Professor Bomfield is here in India for a brief visit to explore partnerships with different universities. And on behalf of the Knowledge Consortium of Gujarat and SANDHAN, I sincerely thank you, madam, for sparing your time in between your tight schedule for this lecture here. Professor Bomfield is a professor of pedagogy, policy and innovation and an international dean from the University of Glasgow, UK. Her doctorate was on Swami Vivekananda's practical Vedanta. This is an amazing thing for all of us that somebody from UK who's done her research on Vivekananda is here to share her views with us on such an important theme. She's published extensively in the area of teachers' professional development and has keen interest in religious education. Professor Bomfield has about 10 students pursuing their doctorate under her guideship. She is also the editor of the British Educational Research Journal. As we are all aware, Swami Vivekananda has had a very deep impact on the education system, always, and continues to do so. And today, we have a very distinguished speaker sharing her views on science and Sanskrit, Vivekananda's views on education, for which we feel deeply privileged, madam. Now, over to Professor Bomfield.
Thank you. It's indeed a privilege to be asked to deliver this lecture today. As a Bengali educated in schools founded by Scottish missionaries, Vivekananda was adept at identifying opportunities to bring together elements of modern Western thought with the Indian tradition. He was able to find creative tension in the opposition of Western materialism and Indian spirituality, and use this to promote pride in their heritage amongst the Indian middle class. It was this combination of confidence in an Indian cultural and spiritual identity with the capacity to meet the British on their own terms that was to make a significant contribution to the development of the nationalist movement in the early 20th century. Whilst in the 21st century, national differences may be subsumed in the common pursuit of material prosperity in a global market, regional, ethnic and religious differences are now the sources of conflict, and across the world, the gap between the rich and the poor is growing. It is Vivekananda's ability to subvert dichotomies that is needed today if we are to meet the challenge of globalization. Education plays a central role in the intellectual and character formation of the next generation, and is therefore important in the development of society. Consequently, the questions of who should have access to education, what they should learn, and how they should learn will always be contested issues. Understanding how issues have been addressed in different countries and contexts and at different times is not simply a matter of historical interest. Educational ideas from the past merit attention today. Formal education tends to be a very conservative process in which innovation is hard to implement or to sustain. Consideration of Vivekananda's advocacy of an approach to education that combined Western rational scientific inquiry with the values of the Sanskrit tradition, embodied in the ideal of the Gurukula system, not only provides insight into the rich cross-fertilization of ideas in 19th century Bengal, but may also suggest solutions to contemporary dilemmas. Globalisation need not necessarily result in homogenisation, as the opportunity for communication across cultures enables us to see what is distinctive as well as what we hold in common. My interest in Vivekananda began in the 1970s as a student interested in the interplay between political and religious ideas in processes of social reform. I was introduced to his writings, published in English, while studying a course on the modern Indian tradition as an undergraduate. It is in the spirit of reflexivity exemplified by Vivekananda in his encounters with the West, in which the perspective of an outsider can enable the familiar to become strange and the strange familiar, that I offer you now my perspective on what we may learn today from his advocacy of science and Sanskrit. The epigram Science and Sanskrit is used by Vivekananda to encapsulate the combination of Indian traditional education and knowledge from the West, and both terms should be understood in their broadest sense. Vivekananda's first recorded use of the epigram occurs during his stay at the court of the Maharaja Mangal Singh at Alwar in the spring of 1891. Vivekananda was introduced to Mangal Singh by his Dewan in the hope that a Western-educated sadhu could be an influence on the prince, who had little interest in traditional Indian culture. At first, we are told, Mangal Singh was contemptuous of a man who had the qualifications necessary for a career in British India and yet had chosen to be a sadhu. However, on meeting Vivekananda, we are told that Mangal Singh quickly changed his mind, asking him to stay in Alwar to instruct the people of the state in the importance of combining the best of Indian culture with Western knowledge. Vivekananda was not the first person to use the epigram Science and Sanskrit. Dayananda Saraswati, founder of the Arya Samaj, had used the phrase and in a similar context when staying at the court of the Raja of Ajmer. It should be noted here that the discussion of current educational issues in the courts of the princes of the princely states evokes the traditional relationship of the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, in which the acquisition of knowledge was free but supported by the material wealth of the princes, and it's not coincidental. The fact that Vivekananda may not have been original in his use of the epigram need not diminish its significance. It is Vivekananda's ability to identify the possibilities of his time and to present ideas in a way that had popular appeal that was one of his strengths. We also know that the need for a programme of national education to promote the regeneration of India was a recurrent theme in speeches and letters throughout his life. The salient features of Vivekananda's thinking on education are recorded in a letter headed "The Education That India Needs," written to the editor of Bharati in April 1897. He describes education as the uncovering or releasing of the potential lying within each individual. It is a process of removing barriers rather than instilling knowledge. This is consistent with his interpretation of evolution as the gradual expression of what was already involved in the interpretation of the concept of the realization of Brahman in his practical Vedanta. Education will enable people to take control of their own affairs by using the energy and concentration that will follow from the release of the infinite power of Brahman. Whilst the potential already lies within, Vivekananda's vision of education for India also includes learning scientific and technical knowledge. It is this alliance of the epigram Science and Sanskrit with the philosophical foundation for action in the world through practical Vedanta that gives substance to his approach to education. The letter outlines how the education system should be organised with centres in major cities for the training of sannyasins to teach both secular and religious knowledge. Schools would be free, open to all, regardless of gender or social position, and include practical workshops on the manufacturing of goods. Funding would be provided by money earned from teaching Westerners about Indian spirituality and from the sale of the goods produced in the workshops. The form public education should take in India had exercised both the British administration and Indian leaders for at least 80 years prior to Vivekananda's travels and his use of the epigram science and Sanskrit. The East India Company had been reluctant to get involved in educating Indians until the British government forced their hand. The body responsible for education policy in British India was the General Committee of Public Instruction, appointed in 1823 under the Charter of the East India Company, which had stated, at least 1 lakh of rupees to be spent on the revival and improvement of literature and the encouragement of the learned people of India and of the introduction and promotion of the knowledge of the sciences among British territories in India. The Court of Directors of the East India Company became increasingly critical of the General Committee of Public Instruction, which they thought stressed Hindu learning at the expense of what they called useful learning. The shift in attitude within the East India Company was indicative of the tendency among the British for interest in Indian culture to be gradually replaced by more commercial interests. Lord Macaulay, the President of the General Committee of Public Instruction, notorious for the statement that he would not exchange a single shelf of books in an English library for the entire corpus of Sanskrit and Persian scholarship, was the champion of what has been called the Anglicist cause. In the minute of 1835, Macaulay promoted the creation of a class of persons, Indian in blood and colour, but English at least in opinions, in morals and intellect, who could act as mediators between the British and the millions whom we govern. Despite these extreme and rather ignorant views, some Indian reformers, including Ramoun Roy, supported the Anglicist approach because they wanted the benefits of access to modern European thought and the study of science. The first person to promote such schools in Bengal was the Scottish missionary Alexander Duff, who founded what became Duff College with the support of Ramoun Roy. Despite the earlier success of institutions such as Presidency College in Calcutta, established in 1817 to instruct the sons of India in the European and Asiatic languages and sciences, by the 1890s it was clear that access to useful knowledge could not be assumed as a benefit of a British Indian education. The emphasis on instilling the desired English attitudes too often led to the exercise of strict bureaucratic control. Students were examined on their ability to recall specific texts, not on their understanding of concepts and problems. Whilst the study of literature might be maintained, if not enriched within this framework, science and practical skills could not. What is more, the portrayal of India culture in the set textbooks was negative. And as a statistician in the Indian civil service and a Times leader writer on Indian affairs observed, as long as Indian history is presented to the Indian youth as nothing but a dreary record of disunion and subjection, our Anglo-Indian schools can scarcely become the nurseries of a self-respecting nation. The alliance of Indian and English approaches to education in late 19th century Bengal combined aspects that were the most negative to progress. The textbook culture was a joint product of the soil as it existed and the conditions created by the colonial bureaucracy. The soil was composed of archaic pedagogical practices that treated memorization as a mode of achievement. To be eligible for government funding, schools must teach according to the prescribed textbooks and enter pupils for the public examinations. Attempts to provide an education that gave a more positive picture of India's past and included scientific and technical training were very badly needed at this time in India. Not everyone took the view that the traditional practices were against progress. The revival of traditional forms of education was supported by a faction known as the Gurukula Party in the Arya Samaj. The aim of the Gurukula system was to form the character of the student by encouraging the fulfillment of dharma and direct his aspirations towards the highest end of human life, the saving knowledge that leads to moksha. Students must be completely obedient to their teacher, celibate and self-disciplined. The teacher was a role model, embodying wisdom and spirituality as they passed on the oral tradition of sacred teachings. Teachers would only take a few pupils at a time, and students lived with their teacher. Tuition was free, and students would only give a gift to their teacher at the end of their studies. Central to the traditional approach to education in India was the tenet that knowledge could not be sold. This had been one of the barriers for many Pandits to taking up positions in the Sanskrit colleges when they were established by the British, because they didn't want to be part of a system where education was a commodity. In the Gurukula system, teachers were largely self-sufficient, although additional support came from the Kshatriyas indirectly through their traditional patronage of Brahmins. The student was